So thanks a million, Gavin, for that beautifully woven narrative and tour de force through it. So I'm going to give a presentation which is kind of more nuts and boltsy about the work of ENAR Ireland and or aspects of the work of ENAR Ireland that speak to some of the issues that have come up in this conference. So it's about hate crime, hate speech, counter narratives, counter speech, and just some of the work we're doing, and hopefully then this will, coupled with Gavin's talk, will be able to stimulate a discussion with yourselves in the room. So I'm Shane O'Curry. I'm the Director of ENAR Ireland, which is the European Network Against Racism Ireland. It's a civil society networking organisation which works together with now 70 organisations, including trade unions, local intercultural organisations, migrant support organisations, traveller organisations, etc. I can see a few members in the room here, to come up with common policy to tackle racism and racism on all levels. So racism on an interpersonal level, the kind of classic racism that springs to mind when you talk about racism, through to racist hate crime, but also structural and institutional racism, and bringing together an understanding of the link of that. And we are, as our name suggests, there's a European dimension to the work we're doing. We are the Irish coordination of the European Network Against Racism, which has members in 30 European states, and which itself has 120 organisations across Europe. And so one of the things that we do with ENAR Ireland, and it's something that I've been interested in for almost 2 decades now. In fact, more than 2 decades. So I used to work for the Pat Finucane Centre, Human Rights Centre in Derry, in the north of Ireland, monitoring the conflict there. And one of the striking things about the conflict there is the predominance of fake news or state propaganda. There was a particular way in which state broadcasters and mainstream institutions were presenting the conflict, and there were received truths that were recycled, and then there were a lot of narratives that were not being heard. And I became very interested in this business of uncovering hidden narratives. So I became involved with working with families of people whose loved ones had been killed by the state, and then whose experience in the media, and whose experience with the police, and whose experience with the court service and the coroner, etc., was to denigrate them and downplay their experience. So I became involved with, I think, only read something and some theory that resonated with it much later when I read Jim Ife, Human Rights from Below. But it became involved in the business of uncovering hidden narratives and using community development principles, which are very similar to community radio principles and development education principles, to work with people directly affected by a violent and a marginalizing process like racism, like sectarianism, or like the state targeting of a particular community, and working with them to put them in charge of their narrative. And so with ENAR Ireland, we have the Ireport.ie system, and the idea was that so we know in Ireland, in a way which resonates with international experience, some 90% of racist incidents go unreported, and that's kind of a rule of thumb about the level of underreporting. Time again, our own data shows this, and data from various independent studies in Ireland and internationally show that something like 90% of people from an ethnic minority background who experience a racist incident will not report it to the authorities. So we have a huge iceberg, which we're only seeing the tip of. And so the idea of the Ireport.ie system was to look at some of the barriers to people reporting so that we could uncover their narratives, uncover their stories, and provide a platform for people as best we could who experience those to tell their own stories and to take part in a national conversation to say, look what's happening to us. So it's about changing the story on racism. And so we came up with the Ireport.ie system, and I have some over there beside Gavin. I have some copies of our latest report, which people are free to help themselves to, which I'll give out afterwards. That it would be a confidential, independent, civil society-based. That is, it's not the state. You're not grassing people up to the police, and the police aren't going to be involved in this. This is about telling stories that haven't been told before, because they have value in shifting a culture. And it was open for people who directly experience racism themselves to report, for people to be supported by someone to report, but also for somebody working in a group that supports people from a particular background to report if a client or somebody that they work with has experienced something. It takes advantage of internet technology to allow people to upload photographs, screen grabs, videos, and other files, so that you can illustrate what has happened as well. And it's something that's amenable to local groups to use for themselves. The whole point about this is that it is a resource primarily for people from ethnic minority backgrounds to tell their stories about racism, and that means working with local groups. And so, what is it? So it's online, it's non-state, it's confidential. We don't unless we're compelled by law, unless somebody reveals that they're about to murder someone, or unless somebody reveals something that's extremely serious, and in practice it hasn't happened. We don't tell the police without the person's permission. It's independent. It can be anonymous. You don't have to leave your contact details. And I put it's non-verified and it's verified in the same way. So it's non-verified in a legal sense. That is that we don't it's not part of an investigation. So we don't look for corroboration in a legal sense, because we're not building a case. But it is verified in an academic sense, in that the methodology is transparent, the results that we produce year after year are consistent with each other, and the data is overseen and analysed by Dr. Lucy Michael from Ulster University, who writes up the data in peer-reviewed journals. So it's verified in that sense. It's transparent in that our methodology is transparent, so it can be, you can interrogate it. It's democratic because it's accessible to everybody, and it conforms to international norms. So we present data in a way, and this is the part that I think is potentially the most empowering, is that we're part of a conversation with the European, with ECRI, with the European Council on Racism and Interculturalism, with the Fundamental Rights Agency, with the OSCE, with other international organisations, and with other civil society actors, as to how do you present hate crime so that our data can be compared to the Garda data, that our data can be compared to the UK or the German or an EU average data, so that we know how we're doing. So that, and to enable the international organisations to inspect Ireland regularly. So it's quite easy. There's a 1, 2, 3. You go to Ireport.ie, you click on Ireport. Number 2, you answer the questions, and then you submit. And if you say that you would like to be contacted we may contact you. And if you don't want to be contacted, you don't leave your contact details, so we can't contact you. And I suppose we may contact you bit is also crucial, because some people, we found again and again, some people tell their story or their experience very eloquently and very clearly in their own words. And it's very striking that in reading the narrative, that person would be a very good advocate. And we will then contact people and say, potentially, would you be prepared to speak to the media about your experience? Because that's the whole point of it, is that people tell their own stories. And the media love it because, even though they like data and counterfacts, and we produce counterfacts in order to dispel racist myths, they want to hear human stories. And best media practice in developing a counter narrative tells you that you should tell a human story. So we do that. These are the things that we do with the data. So, people can experience a range of types of racist incidents. So going from discrimination at work or going into a pub, etc., to racist crime, to microaggressions, to racism online. And you report it. It takes about 15 minutes to report. We produce the data, and we produce these reports that Gavin has there in front of him. And then we share them systematically with European level organisations in data sharing on racism. We become a repository, and we become the go-to organisation to speak about data about racism in Ireland. We share it with legislators. We give copies of this report to all members of the Oireachtas, plus civil servants, anybody with a special interest in racism. We give it to the media and the public, and we share it among our network with NGOs, and we make it available to community groups to take community action. And the important thing is, again, as I said, is that we produce hard data, but also we produce real stories. So we get people to tell the stories that they experienced, and we get people to tell not just what happened, but the impact on them, so that we're bringing a marginalized and silenced experience into the mainstream, so that people can appreciate it. And all human beings love stories, and we remember how something makes us feel much more than percentages and data and the like. So it's very important to do that piece of work. And I guess that piece of work is the most labour-intensive piece of work that, and I know from my experience with the Pat Finucane Centre, and I was talking to Sally earlier on about the work that Near FM does around this, that the piece of work of putting people in charge of telling their own story is a community development piece of work, and it is I think the single most important thing, in my humble opinion, that we as a movement against racism can do. But it's very resource and labour intensive, and so, for example, when our funding for our community development function was not renewed in the last funding round, our ability to develop the capacity of people from ethnic minority backgrounds to self-advocate was severely cut. And so our Action Against Racism group, which we had already gotten off the ground at the time, might not be able to get off the ground with the current resources that we have now. Just a little bit about hate speech. So just why are we opposed? So some of our work brings us into monitoring hate speech and hate crime through those. So hate speech and hate crime, and specifically hate speech, they're part of a spectrum, that goes from a microaggression on one end of the spectrum all the way to genocide on the other. Words count. The dehumanizing language of racism can provide justification for killing and genocide. And in fact, if you look at the 8 stages of genocide, hate speech alone is involved in five of those stages, as in classification, symbolization, dehumanization, denial. So we're talking about Holocaust denial, etc., and the polarization of communities. And our own Ireport data tells us that 66% of violent incidents involve racist or dehumanizing language. So that's something that happens again and again. So when somebody is being violently assaulted, that it is, and that's a higher percentage than the overall racist incidents of microaggression or discrimination, which are often, where the racism is often more covert or subtle. But dehumanizing racist language is associated with 66% of violent incidents. Again, so hate crimes. We focus on hate crimes because they're extremely damaging to an individual, and this is why we campaign for hate crime legislation. They can be seen as message crimes from one community to another, so that's the polarization step of this 8 steps of genocide, and it can create an us and them situation, and that's what it does. So just to briefly talk about, so this is our Love Not Hate campaign that I referenced earlier on, where we worked with a group of people from minority ethnic backgrounds who had all, what they have in common is that they've experienced racism and they want to do something about it. And we have been campaigning with a number of other NGOs called the steering committee, the National Steering Committee on Hate Crime. And Anne is a member of that committee over there, I can see. And I believe Jennifer Schwepp from University of Limerick was in speaking to you about that. So we have, so we've been arguing for hate crime legislation, which doesn't exist in Ireland, even though Ireland has European and international obligations for that. And in fact, ENAR Ireland has triggered an inspection of Ireland under the framework decision on racism for its compliance. So in Ireland we have the Incitement to Hatred Act, which addresses some forms of hate speech, but which is not exactly a law prohibiting hate speech. I may be accused of fake news here, because what I can tell you is that the 1989 Incitement to Hatred Act is notoriously ineffective. And I maintain that there were less than 20 prosecutions, I think it may be 18, and that there was one conviction which was overturned, so that it means that in fact nobody has ever been convicted under the Act. Other people have different data. Part of the problem is that we get this information in a hearsay way from the director, from chatting to people off the record with the Department of Public Prosecutions. This data isn't published. It's not available anywhere, and we're trying to resolve that at the moment. So I may be guilty of fake news here. So my attitude has been, well, if they're not giving us the data, I'm going to make this bold claim and let them refute it. But maybe I'm guilty of generating fake news here. And so we have this campaign. And then, and Gavin referenced this, so there's a variety of responses that we can have to hate crime and hate speech. So there is a plethora of international law, and I've just listed them. Some are there, the European Commission on Racism and Interculturalism, their reports, the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the European Convention on Human Rights, the Framework Convention of National Minorities, and the Framework Decision on Racism and Xenophobia. It goes on. They all put obligations on Ireland to have hate crime legislation and to some extent restrictions on hate speech. We have the Incitement to Hatred Act, which I mentioned. We are campaigning for hate crime legislation in Ireland at the moment. There are no plans either with ourselves or with others to have specific hate speech legislation, because basically I think it's very tricky. It's very hard to ban speech, and it's not something that I would feel comfortable with. I don't think that there's a formula. The difficulty is finding a formula that would protect minorities that could not be used against minorities by people in powerful positions, and that's the danger. And I think Gavin spoke to that very eloquently about the basic power structures not really changing. There are social media European Commission guidelines for social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter at the moment. And we are which is Gavin spoke about that, which is a voluntary code that they have all subscribed to self-police in partnership with the European Commission, which ENAR Ireland is part of helping the European Commission to monitor at the moment. So I would actually strongly encourage you that if you come across content on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube this month, that is for the rest of the month of April and for the first couple of days of May, could you please log it with Ireport.ie so that we can police it, basically, so that we can see what those social media platforms are doing about taking it down. So if you could take a screen grab and a link and send them to us. It should take you about 3 minutes to do a report into the Ireport system, and that will allow us to then report it to them and then monitor how they respond to our report to them, and then we can report to the Commission on how they fared. And then of course there are press guidelines and broadcasting authority guidelines, and there's the Defamation Act, which I always so there's a review going on currently, and there was some discussion within NGOs about could the Defamation Act be changed to include group defamation, so that if I say something offensive or genocidal about Muslims as a whole, or Roma as a whole, is there a way that it can be addressed? Now, I'm told by legal experts whose understanding of these things is way beyond mine, that it may not technically be possible, but it seems an anomaly to me that as an anti-racist, that for hypothetically speaking, if I were to call the Iona Institute homophobic, which of course I wouldn't, that I couldn't do that because of the Defamation Act, or I couldn't call a broadcaster a racist for fear of them invoking the Defamation Act, and yet somebody can say something that's patently racist and defamatory to a group, and not be sanctioned. It seems like a gross anomaly. And so what's left are I put in blue the positive things we can do, is the ability to develop counter narratives, to ensure that people from minority backgrounds are the messengers themselves of these counter narratives. They are the narrators. They're telling their own stories, and that means telling those stories, but it also means having more black faces, more Arab faces, more travellers, etc. on RTE, because there's hardly any. Having them having them on other media platforms like NEAR, and like I'm very proud to be associated with NEAR. I'm very proud to be here because of the work they do in that area. But again, that work requires a lot of investment, and it's a big resource intense piece of community development work, and I would reference my new favourite writer, Jim Ife, Human Rights from Below, with respect to that. And I think that's it. If you have any questions, we can take it from there. Thanks very much. Yeah.